Hey, what's up, ladies and gentlemen? You're now tuned into the TruthSeekah podcast. I'm your host, TruthSeekah, excited and delighted to be with you guys again for another episode, man. We cover all things spiritual, spirituality, anything and everything in between of that. So I hope you guys are ready to go deep. We're going deep tonight. Shout out to everybody hanging out with us in the live streams, everybody listening on YouTube, Periscope, Twitch, Facebook, no matter where you are, man. Thanks for tuning in. Shout out to everybody who is catching this on the podcasting apps, no matter where you're listening from. Thank you guys so much for being a part of this community. It means the world. I want to give a shout out to everybody supporting my work via Patreon. This is a listener-supported, listener-funded show. It doesn't exist without your help. Thank you for believing in the work that I'm bringing to the table and making this thing possible, man. Thank you guys. And if you'd like to support, head on over to patreon.com/TruthSeekah. There you get access to my entire discography of music, which is 200 plus songs, our Thursday night School of the Mystics, and a bunch of really cool stuff that we're bringing to the table. So if you're looking for a community, like-minded individuals and people to roll ideas off of, make sure you check out our Discord server. You get access to all that stuff as well. Patreon.com/TruthSeekah. Also, my new book. I say new book. It's been out a year. If you haven't had a chance to get it, you can get it at TruthSeekah.com. My book, Spirit Realm, Angels, Demons, Spirits, and the Sovereignty of God, forward by Jordan Maxwell. If you have not had a chance to get it, make sure you go to TruthSeekah.com. Get your copy. If you need a copy of the audio book, one will be provided for you. You can get a free Audible download by clicking the link that's in the description. If you go to my Audible trial, you can listen to me read it to you for free. Make sure you check it out, Spirit Realm, forward by Jordan Maxwell. We're going to go ahead and jump into tonight's discussion. I'm joined by my friend, Paul Wallis. Paul, what's up, man? Welcome to the podcast. How are you?
G'day, TruthSeekah. Thanks so much for having me on your show.
Interesting topic to bring to the table. Very near and dear to my heart for sure, and ready to dive into it with you, covering your new book, Escaping from Eden. Does Genesis teach that the human race was created by God or engineered by ETs? Very intriguing.
Yeah, I can see that would be close to your heart with Jordan Maxwell providing your endorsement on your book there. That's fantastic.
Yeah, I think he's the one who opened the door for for this talk for me. And it's right up my alley. I really appreciate his experiences and his stories, really, that he brought to the table. And even diving into some of Sitchin's work. And for me, I started with that kind of stuff. And then, as you know, there wasn't a lot of Christianity talking about the Elohim or being seated or anything to do with the angels coming here and dealing with mankind. But that kind of opened up the door for me to look into much later the divine council theory with Dr. Michael Heiser. And both of those are like headbutting each other. Sitchin is wrong. That Dr. Heiser has that website, and so they kind of counteract one another. I found my truth in the midst of all the studying to be right in the middle of Sitchin and Dr. Heiser. So looking to get your opinion on some of that stuff too. So,
well, it's funny because when I started out on the path that led to Escaping from Eden, I actually hadn't heard of Zecharia Sitchin or Michael Heiser.
Wow.
Or Jordan Maxwell. I didn't know any of these names. My way in was really from the Bible. My background is in Christian ministry. I was a church planter for many years and a church doctor for many years. I worked as a theological educator for Pentecostal churches in the UK and Australia. Served as an archdeacon out here in Australia. And in all that time, I was working with the Bible. I was training pastors to interpret the Bible. And it was really out of that work that I found myself on a journey that really got unlocked by some translation questions. That was the doorway down this rabbit hole that led to Escaping from Eden and to these what are controversial conclusions in sort of faith circles. And as I was doing the research, I started coming across Zecharia Sitchin, Michael Heiser, Marobinho, and I thought, oh goodness, so I'm not the first person, I thought, to have these thoughts. And what do I do? Should I quickly read up on all these guys? And at that point, I thought, no, I'm not going to do that, because I'm on a path here of working out for myself from a theological start point. What's going on in Genesis? What's going on in the Bible? What is the correct way to interpret all the language we have here? I really need to follow the integrity of my own thoughts. And then once I've sort of drawn some conclusions, then I can look around and see, does anyone else agree with me? And at that point, I found, yes, I'm not the first person to tread this territory. And I think I'm glad I made that decision, because now I think there's more significance in the overlap. You know, when you go to Michael Heiser, he made his own journey, Sitchin made his own journey. And then when you find an overlap, there's a significance to it.
Yeah.
And so that's why I made that choice. So I still got a lot of reading to catch up on, but it really is that journey through Genesis and a work of translation that led me to the conclusion that many of the stories that our religions have curated as stories about God are really memories of our ancestors' contact with other species colonizing planet Earth in the distant past.
What year was this stuff taking place for you, where you started to kind of open up to this broader understanding and start to do a little bit more research? What year was it?
Well, I could put a number of different start points on, but I think a really significant seed was sown when I was 11 years old, because that's when I encountered the work of Erich von Däniken. My mum and dad introduced me to him, actually, at a dinner party. They were discussing his work. Chariots of the Gods was charting at that time. It had been out for about 10 years by that point, but there'd been a movie and it was being talked about on the TV. And so they introduced me to his work, and my ears pricked up, because I already felt dissatisfied with the explanations I was hearing of where we came from. It seemed to me there was a real gap in our ability to explain ourselves as a conscious, intelligent, technological species. I found that religion was a little bit lazy, and in the answer, oh, well, God made us, we're God's special creation, that fell short in explaining how come we're animals then? How come we're so obviously one of the animals? How does that work? And all this commonality that we have with other animal species, not quite explained there. And then the scientific explanation also fell short, because the only thing that puts us at the top of the tree on this planet is our consciousness, intelligence, and technology. And science couldn't quite say where that came from. There was a gap. Erich von Däniken said that an external intervention makes sense of that gap. That was his thesis. And that got me going. So that, from the age of 11, that was in the back of my mind. And the question was there. And then I guess the next really significant thing that happened in terms of a moment was 2009, when the most conservative pope in my lifetime. Now, I'm not a Catholic. I don't follow the popes, but I couldn't help noticing that the most conservative pope in my lifetime had called on the Pontifical Academy of Sciences to hold a colloquium, which was a symposium of top theologians and scholars, to talk about the theological implications of contact with other species. And then his spokespeople came out and met the press, and they, to give them credit, they made a lot of it. There was a year lead into the event, and then there was a lot of meeting the press, and they were saying very loud and clear, we need to be ready, not just to embrace the idea of a populated universe, but to be ready to embrace a brother or sister alien.
Yeah.
And they weren't talking about discovering moss on a moon of Mars. They were talking about intelligent, technological alien species turning up, and the urgency with which that happened. And this phrase that kept getting used, we should be ready sooner than anyone anticipates to embrace a brother or sister alien, got me thinking, what do they know? Because it looks like they're preparing us for some disclosure. It looked like they were expecting another authority to disclose that we're in contact, and then they could say, oh, don't worry, everybody. Remember, we covered this. It doesn't change anything. It just gives us a bigger picture of God.
Yeah.
And that caught my attention. And a gauntlet was really thrown down by the senior astronomer of the Vatican Observatory, Reverend Dr. Guy Consolmagno. He said, we shouldn't be surprised to encounter intelligent alien brothers and sisters. He said, because they're in the Bible. They're in the Old Testament and the New Testament. And when that happened, I thought, I've really got to look into that, because how could I have missed that? You know, for 15 years, I've been training pastors in how to interpret the Bible. Could I really have missed something as glaring as aliens in the Bible? And so from that moment, I thought, I've got to drill down into this. And it wasn't until 2017, really, that process of research accelerated. And I realized I was in the process of writing my next book. And I realized what direction it was going in. And the moment I sat down and asked the translation questions, why is this funny word Elohim a plural word? That was the red pill. The word Elohim often gets translated as God, but it's a plural word.
Yeah.
And so the moment I addressed that question and said, well, what happens if we read that in the plural? What happens to the stories? Well, the change that happens changed my world. And that was the beginning of the story of escaping from Eden.
Well, I'm going to save you a lot of time, brother, because when the word Elohim is used, it means Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.
Yes.
I'm kidding. I know you've heard that and continue to hear that.
I know you're kidding. And I have heard that from people.
Yeah.
Because, of course, the first time people are confronted with this information, an initial reaction from a person of faith can be, well, that can't be right because it disagrees with conclusions I've already drawn. And yes, they say, well, there's the plural. It must mean Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. The problem with that is that these Elohim conflict with one another. They go to war against one another. Some of the Elohim want human beings upgraded and intelligent and conscious. Others of the Elohim want the humans so unintelligent that we don't even know we're naked. And they go to war. The Father, Son, and Holy Spirit don't go to war. The Elohim make mistakes. They make absurd mistakes. They fail to anticipate things that the reader can see from the get-go. So it just doesn't have any wheels, the argument that Elohim is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. It means, if you just look at the root meaning, powerful ones.
Yeah.
And the thing that convinced me that was the right reading of that word is that the way the stories change when you read the God stories in Genesis and further into the Bible as stories of the powerful ones, they flip and suddenly line up in parallel with the Sumerian, Babylonian, Akkadian, and Assyrian stories carried on the ancient cuneiform tablets.
Yeah.
It becomes apparent very quickly that the Bible stories are summary versions of the stories of the sky people in the Mesopotamian canon. And once you've seen that parallel, you can't go back to seeing it the old way. Now, we didn't know this until the 1800s because we couldn't translate the Mesopotamian stories until the 1800s. 1835 was when we found the translation key. And so, unfortunately, the wheels of faith communities and theological change can grind very slow. And so there are lots of people in the churches who are unaware of these parallels, unaware of these source documents, unaware that the editors of the Bibles they're reading mostly believe that the biblical texts are based on stories of sky people in the Mesopotamian stories.
Which is every creation story almost, right?
Yes, it is. That's right. You can go to almost any culture around the world and you will find parallels with these stories. And as I started researching Escaping from Eden, that was the evidence that for me built up and up and up, that there is a memory of what happened, of where we came from, who we were in contact with, and different cultures have found different ways of curating the same basic story, the same memories of the same traumas that our ancestors experienced, and memories of some of the same details about those who came, modified our ancestors, and governed over us.
I got so many questions for you, and we could just keep going, but I want to paint the picture for the person like who's the first time hearing this, and we're well studied in this stuff, but for the person who this is their first time hearing this, going back to Genesis in the Garden of Eden and the actual title of the book, like escaping Eden. Who were our creators then? If it wasn't God, what are you saying, that aliens created us, like, and put humans here? What are you actually saying moving forward?
Yeah, it's a very layered story. There are many places you could start, but if we start in Genesis 1, what's very interesting that's happening there, and it happens in other mythologies and ancestral narratives around the world, is we've got something that looks like a creation story, and everybody's familiar with the "let there be light" moment, and then we have the sun and the moon and the stars, and then the planet gets made and improved, and life on Earth is developed. Just go back and read that again, because before the first word of creation is spoken, the planet already exists. So before light, before sun, moon, stars, planet Earth already exists, flooded and shrouded in darkness. And many of the ancient narratives begin that way, with a devastated planet Earth, and then somebody turning up to rehabilitate it. So Genesis follows that pattern. Many of the stories begin with the separation of the waters, the clearing of the sky. So all of a sudden we can see the sun again, and the moon and the stars. And then the waters are separated into salt water, fresh water, land is cleared. You can hear this in Mesoamerican, African, Genesis, Mesopotamian stories. They all have these same themes.
Zulu.
And these Zulu as well, that's right. And really interesting details about the land being cleared by vortices of wind. Well, that's in Genesis, because what happens is the powerful ones turn up in a ruach, a word that often gets translated as spirit, but a bit of translation work reveals that's a craft. It's a craft that hovers over the waters, and that's where they begin their work. Ruach gets used further in the Bible. It's in Ezekiel. It's in the stories of Moses, and Ezekiel gives us great detail on what a ruach looked like, what color it was. It was silver. It had a glass-like canopy, and he describes the wheels of the ruach in such detail that NASA has a patent on those wheels and uses them on some of its craft on Mars. So what you've got is beings arriving in technology who then do work on the planet. And these memorializations represent the fact that this is an eyewitness account that our ancestors have curated. So they were already here in some shape or form. And what those who arrived in these stories do is not create our ancestors, but modify them. And that's how the story goes. So where life originated, I now hold the view that Francis Crick held, the co-discoverer of DNA. He believed that the genetic coding for conscious intelligent life landed on the planet because it's been seeded through at least this part of the cosmos. The Zulu have a wonderful story of that. And that theory is called panspermia. And a lot of very serious credentialed scientists hold that view. The European Space Agency has spent more than $8 billion testing the theory by sending probes up onto comets. So the genetic coding arrives. Whenever it lands on a hospitable planet, it will result ultimately in conscious life. And then the stories of our mythologies seem to cut in when some neighbors appear, probably the result of the same panspermia, the same seeding, and then modify what they find here. And the story suggests that they found something along the lines of a primate and modified the primates into us. If you read the Mesoamerican version of the story in the Popol Vuh, it's very specific that apes and us share a common ancestor, and that apes and us were part of the same experimentation that was performed by these visitors. So that may be a bit of a paradigm shift. It certainly was for me reading that, but it caught my attention that centuries before Darwin, the ancient Mayan culture had made this connection, weren't saying that we were descended from apes, but saying that we both were descended from a shared ancestor. And that's what science is telling us today in DNA research.
A lot more questions. To be clear, there's some people even in chat who are saying Anunnaki. Is this the same thing as the Anunnaki or the Elohim? Is this the same thing, or is it a little bit different? I've always thought them a little bit different in my mind, but would you say that would be the same thing?
Yes, the stories that people know as the Anunnaki stories, they are the stories from the Sumerian canon. In Escaping from Eden, I refer to them as sky people because the glyph that's used, the little cuneiform marking that's used on the tablets to indicate these beings, simply indicates the sky. And the flow of the story tells you that they are people or beings who've come from the sky. And yes, those are the Anunnaki narratives.
Most stories of the Anunnaki paint them to be like some type of bad guys, like these rulers that created humans to mine gold. Is kind of the narrative that comes along with that word. Would this be similar to the Elohim in our story?
I think that is part of the story. And yes, the mining gold connection is there in Genesis as well. It's very easy to miss. But if you read the Eden story in Genesis, we're told, for some reason, we're told the location of Eden, where the humans are safe in this enclosed zone. And then we're also told that it's conveniently handy for some key mineral deposits. Well, who on earth needs to know that? Adam and Eve, in their blissful innocence in the Garden of Eden, don't need to know about key mineral deposits, do they? But there is another phrase in Genesis that says that the powerful ones put the humans to work. And you put those two together, and there's a little hint that that work wasn't like gardening. And yes, I think there's real evidence for ancient gold mining in southern Africa that appears to be a couple of 100,000 years old. Now, science says that our ancestors were here at that time, looking pretty much as we do today, but not quite as smart. Not smart enough to farm and build cities, but smart enough to work in someone else's mine. So yes, those stories do join up. But I think, you see, the word Anunnaki or sky people, it's interesting because it doesn't necessarily tell you that we're talking about a single demographic. Anunnaki, some people have suggested it would be helpful for us simply to translate that as astronaut, because that's what we're looking at. People who've come here from somewhere else, people who've come from the heavens. And you don't have to get far into the Mesopotamian stories or into the Genesis story before you realize there are factions and there's conflict, and you may have a number of ET species bumping up against each other. And by the time you get to the stories of the Sky Council or Heavenly Council, which exists in ancestral memory all around the world, and it's there in the Bible too, it's very clear you've got very different demographics. You've got energy-based beings, archonic beings, and then you've got physical visitors as well, all sitting in council, conflicting with one another over the management of Project Earth and Project Humanity. And there are other conflicts too around hybridization in Genesis 6 that suggest you've got a number of different populations, some who may be here purely for the gold, others because of other things to do with the planet, others may be for things to do with us. And that's all part of why there is this conflict rolling on in the background in our distant past and maybe even today.
As this conversation would scare some people. This is the first time they're hearing some talk like this about the Bible, about the creation stories, and I right when I go to say this, I'm reading the chat. They say, "What about Jesus?" I want to interrupt and I want to interject because what sets you apart from most people who talk about the Anunnaki and Genesis 6 in this type of way, as someone who vouches for these stories, right? You're a Christian, you are a believer, and that's one of the main reasons why I was excited to have you on. You weren't someone trying to debunk the Bible, disprove Jesus never existed and was a copy and these kind of things. You're actually a born again believer. So I think that's very interesting to note, and so people know where you're coming from, that you have a faith in the Bible, in Christ, and in God, and those things.
Yeah, that's right. My agenda is not to debunk the Bible, it's to understand the Bible. And it's funny because I would agree with a lot of what debunkers might have to say,
Yeah.
but my agenda is not to deconstruct or destroy, but really to understand. And all my life as a preacher, that was my approach. I want to know, what does the text really say? Where did that text come from? Who wrote that? Why does it say that? And I'm really just trying to get to the bottom of things. It's an obvious question to ask, what about Jesus? Because there's no question that this investigation has reframed my understanding of God, reframed my understanding of Jesus. I still am a person who likes Jesus. I find him very credible. I like his teaching. I seek to live my life by his teaching. But I can see that we have framed our understanding of Jesus very badly, and it flows from the translation problems in the Old Testament. Right at the beginning of Christianity, there was a big debate over whether Christianity should re-endorse the Hebrew Scriptures, a big debate over whether they should be glued on to the teachings of Jesus to make a Bible of Old Testament plus New Testament. And there were some really significant church fathers right at the beginning saying, no, don't do that, because we don't endorse the 6th century BCE edit of those books that turned because there are distortions in it. And the distortions are these. What was happening in that editing, and there's a very broad scholarly consensus that this editing happened in the 6th century BCE to harmonize it, to make it a book that taught a single theology. There is only one God. There is only one source of all things. Well, that's great, and I agree with that. But that led them to try and airbrush out of the old stories any other kinds of higher beings, airbrush out what looked like too many gods, and airbrush out what was actually the memory of ET contact. And they airbrushed it out by translating Elohim in some texts where they're doing wicked things, or they're on the wrong side, as demon, false god, chieftain, and then in texts where Elohim is clearly in charge, they translate it as God. The problem with that is that you end up with God doing abominable things, and you end up with a God who cannot be morally questioned. You end up with a God who will pronounce the death penalty for eating an apple, or genocide people because he's decided he doesn't like them anymore, or bomb the human race back into an animal state because they've built a building that's too tall, or tell a man to kill his only son and then only tell him at the last second not to do it after all. These are the distortions that arise when we translate Elohim as God, and it's a total distortion. These church fathers didn't want to accept that because it makes God a monster. And then that monster is supposed to be the God that Jesus reveals. It's a total mismatch. And I think actually anyone who's got a regard for the teachings of Jesus will have huge questions already about these ancient texts.
Yeah.
Because if Jesus is showing us what God is like, then he can't be this unforgiving, genociding, unpredictable, punitive, horrible being that seems to be revealed in the stories as we have them translated. So for me, Jesus is actually still a real anchor point for me, because I love his teaching, but I think we need to reframe him, get rid of the old framing of those old stories, and then also understand how empire hijacked Christianity using that angry God image to turn Christianity into obedience versus sin, worship versus idolatry, heaven versus hell. I think these are all narratives designed to control and minimize human beings. And the empire thought we can work with that kind of Christianity. And indeed they did.
going back to Genesis in the Old Testament, and we have the El, or the Elohim, the Elo, and there's different, I guess, races, different types of angels, and different rankings and things like that. Where is God in this? Because a lot of times we read, in the English, we just get God, and we get God for when we're talking about ghost in some places. We get God if we're talking about Azazel in some cases, like Astaroth is a god. Like it says God did this. Sometimes it's a capital G, sometimes it's a small g, and you're supposed to know who it is. But as far as the El, and then what we know to be like the almighty, all-knowing God. Some would even say that that's not Yahweh, that it's something even beyond Yahweh, like Yahweh was another El himself, or a creator God that was over, the land. So where does like the God fit in the midst of smaller gods in the song and dance of the scriptures?
Sure. Well, the Apostle Paul did us a great service when he defined God in his wonderful sermon that he preached in Athens, and it's recorded in Acts 17. He described God as the source of the universe. So that's what I mean when I use the word God, and I don't use the word God for anything else in the universe. I mean the source. The Apostle Paul meant the same. And Mauro Bellino, who is a very eminent Bible translator, he worked on Vatican-approved interlinear Bibles where the translation has to be very, very literal. His view is that God, the source, doesn't make any appearance in the Old Testament at all, that it's all stories about powerful ones, about extraterrestrials. And my view is very close to his view. If you read the Yahweh stories, what I would say is this, that wherever we find Yahweh appearing as an active character in the texts, we are looking at an Elohim.
Yeah.
We're looking at a powerful one. Yahweh refers to himself as a powerful one. Yahweh is referred to as a powerful one in the 10 Commandments. You shall have no other powerful ones. Yeah. Worship only Yahweh. Joshua says, reject the powerful ones that Abraham and Sarah and your ancestors served on the other side of the river, and serve only Yahweh. Yahweh gets really teed off, apparently, when a king who's broken his back wants to know if he's going to live, and he sends his servants to try and get a prognosis from the powerful one of Ekron, a neighboring place with foreigners living in it. And Yahweh says, is there no Elohim here that you could talk to, pointing to himself? So there's a proof text that Yahweh is an Elohim. And in all the texts where he is an active character, we're looking at a powerful one. My view is a little different to Mauro's, because I believe by the time you get to the end of the Old Testament and listen to some of the prophets, I think you're beginning to hear a vision of God the source, like Jesus talked about, like the Apostle Paul talked about. A source that of only one God, God the source. And when they edited the Old Testament, the Hebrew scriptures, that was the view they were trying to paste across the old stories. So hats off for that, but hats on again, because they obscured the extraterrestrial stories that their ancestors had curated for us to know about.
So when we read the Psalms and we hear about, King David and the different psalmists say, praise him with the timbrel, praise him, all you people, and these different, how marvelous is our God who created the heavens, and who, we read stuff about in Job, how he created the stars, and it can ban back the, Orion and the Pleiades and things like that. Is that talking about the essence of God, the spirit of God behind everything, are they talking about Yahweh and some of the other creator gods?
Oh, that's a great question. I think David and the other psalmists are talking about both. And I think the ideas are really fused and confused in those psalms and songs. it's unmistakable that there is a cosmic vision of God in some of those Psalms, but some of the Psalms are very rooted in the history of warfare between Yahweh and the
Yeah.
other Elohim. So I think you've got both threads. That's what makes it such a fascinating topic. Both
Now, what
threads are there.
now like when you get into like a lot of the Hindu traditions and stuff like that, you kind of get this all of these gods are emanations of the one. Like they're just different. Like this is a warring aspect of a god. This is the loving aspect of a god. Almost we kind of have something similar like that in the Catholic faith with the different not popes, but the different saints. This is the saint of virtue. This is the saint of childbearing. Pray to that saint to kind of touch this part of God. Would you think that there's something like that in the Old Testament with the different gods who were an emanation of the one? For me, I think everything and every one is an emanation of sort, the good, the bad, the ugly, all of it.
Yes,
That's how I feel. But
I
does it paint
agree.
that picture a little bit?
That's a good question. I haven't been asked that question before. I absolutely agree with what you're saying there, TruthSeekah. It's absolutely a foundational view of mine now that everything in the universe is an emanation, an expression
Yeah.
of the source. And that was the vision of God that the early Christians had, who lent towards Plato, because the church fathers I mentioned before, who were saying, let's not glue the Hebrew scriptures on, were almost saying, let's glue Plato on instead, because he's got a really full understanding of what's going on. He's pulled together the Eastern understanding that you just referenced with the Western. He's got this beautiful cosmic understanding of what God is, where everything came from, and it frames the story of Jesus beautifully. I agree with them. And I think by the time we get to Jesus, we see that Jesus is really unpacking a lot of that thought. And so that applies, as you rightly say, not just to us as being expressions of God, but visitors too. And yes, there are hints that you've got Elohim in the Hebrew stories who are the healing ones. And then you've got others that are the hybridizing ones and others that are the warfaring ones. So yes, that is really worth probing. I haven't yet taken the time to really get into the Vedas and the Sanskrit texts. I would love to do that because I'm beginning to become aware of aspects of that wisdom that made its way into Plato and that made its way into the writings of not only the apostles, but there are hints of it in some of the later Hebrew and Greek Hebrew writings as well. There's so much in that melting pot. So ask me again next time we talk, and I'll know a little bit more about that.
Yeah. With all this, like I take a lot of the Bible literal, but I have a huge place in my heart for allegory in the Old Testament. Like the deeper meanings of my spiritual walk played out, the hero's journey with each individual, with King David, when I got to face my giants, will I sacrifice that thing that's closest to me that I don't want to let go of? Like, will I give it up only to receive something better, kind of thing? Like in each of these stories, like we see a mirror as we're reading this about ourselves. Where do you stand on the allegory woven within those stories as well?
See, you have said that beautifully, and this is the reason why I'd want to say very clearly, I'm not a debunker of the Bible, because there is phenomenal depth and wisdom in it. And even those editors who did that redaction were communicating something really important and powerful. And what you just said about the hero's journey, it relates to how I wrote Escaping from Eden, because the last sort of prompt telling me, Paul, sit down, drill down into this, work out what's really going on, was when I preached through the stories of beginnings in Genesis in a church I was working in Victoria. And I began to think, wait a minute, this is the hero's journey told over and over and over again. I started reading the story of Adam and Eve, and I thought, hold on, that's really the same as Abraham's story. that's really the same as Noah's story. That's David's story. That's John the Baptist's story. What's going on here? And realize that there is this incredible depth of understanding that has been layered into these stories, so that you can take the story of say, Abraham, and just read it in a literal, plain meaning kind of way, and there'll be information in that. And I love reading it that way, because when I read it that way, there's an account of close encounters with sky people, a very significant encounter. But it's been told by a theologian. So there'll be other theological layers in it as well. And what you say about the hero's journey, it's so worth probing. It defines the story of Jesus as well. He's got like the ultimate hero's journey. So I think that lens is a really useful one to bring to many, many of our world mythologies, the Bible included.
And how you kind of mentioned a while ago, where you said that, almost like alluding to, if this world was destroyed and rebuilt, then these stories that were in our DNA and crafted, like it just keeps coming through the lore, no matter where they are. These people who have not, physically touched or represented, been close to each other on the earth, and they all had the same story. They remember. There's a remembering. And I feel the same way with the hero's journey. Like, if this place was destroyed and comes back, these stories of this dying and being reborn and the triumph and overcoming obstacles, it's in every movie. It's in Star Wars. It's in the Bible. And I just feel like there's something powerful about owning your story and overcoming your fears and overcoming your enemies and those things, which is from Genesis to Revelation as a whole. And then from each prophet, minor prophet, lay person, they all had their own journey that they went through. And, Jesus is like beckoning us to take up our cross as well, right? Because we have our own hero's journey that we must die and be reborn and choose love, just like Luke Skywalker and those guys. There was so many parallels, because during my whole awakening in research and study, I was watching Star Wars for the first time. And there's so many parallels to the scriptures that it's uncanny. One of the things that you bring to the table, reincarnation and channeling and things like that. Listen, I talk about all that stuff in my book too, because it's in the Bible. It's in the Bible, and people don't even know it. And when I found this stuff out, like, I seen it in Star Wars. Like, they have little things of, let me teach you to commune with your teacher who came before you, and Yoda takes Luke Skywalker and teaches him how to Obi-Wan, and teaches him how to commune with Qui-Gon Jinn from behind the grave. And then we read the scriptures when Jesus was going into deep levels of prayer upon the mountain. When we kind of got to follow him at the Mount of Transfiguration, we got to see what he was doing. And he had this visitation where he was meeting with his elders that were teaching him from beyond the grave when he would go into prayer and meditation.
Yeah, that's powerful. And see, George Lucas is a very interesting case in point, because not only do you have layers and layers of ancient mythology being retold in Star Wars, you've also got information like the Death Star. No one had seen Iapetus or Mimas, which are the spitting image of the Death Star, until, when was it? The 1980s, I think. There's a little blurry image we had for the first time. And then 2004 was the first time we could see that the Death Star was the spitting image. So how did George Lucas have that image in 1976? Script writers do sometimes get fed information that has not yet been released to the public. And George Lucas may have had some of that, but I believe that George Lucas has talked about channeled information going into the mix of Star Wars. And I believe that. And I actually think that's where the image of the Death Star came from. Channeling is in the Bible, you're quite right. And it's one of those little anomalies that believers skip over when they're reading the Bible, because it's outside of the frame of the Orthodox mainstream. But if you read John's letters in the New Testament, he's got a little helpful guide to do with channeling. and makes very clear that channeling was part of the early Christian experience before the empire narrowed it all down to
Yeah.
this religion of worship and obedience.
I think that the Bible or inspired writing is something we would call automatic writing or channeled writing, where you're getting inspired by the Holy Spirit or by God. And so I always say in my stuff, like, I channel the heart of God, the heart of the Father. Like, we're channeling his heart. What would he say to his people, to speak to them in
Yes.
love and to build them up and things like that. So, it's
Yes.
not that far outside of the realm of understanding. And when you're thinking
No,
about
it isn't.
channeling
And
information.
I believe in that. I believe that sometimes when we get into storytelling mode, we
Yes.
are actually beginning to channel without necessarily realizing that's what we're doing. And sometimes we tell the truth in fiction very consciously. Sometimes we tell the truth in fiction without knowing that's what we're doing.
I don't think there's that. I feel like there's not anything that you can make up and trying to bring it to the table in fiction that it didn't already exist. Because
Yeah.
with that understanding, man, we've seen some really interesting stuff. And I've interviewed people who have had encounters with any type of entity that you can think of, and I've had so many encounters myself, but it's this place of having faith or believing that it's true, and then it shows itself to you. And
Yeah.
so the channeling, the angels, the demons, if you believe it to be true, what happens? It shows itself to you. There's
Well,
people
that's
who,
right. That's right. You have to have some kind of a framework to understand what you're seeing or understand what you're
Mhm.
experiencing. And it's why, for me, for instance, when Escaping from Eden came out earlier this year, I started being contacted weekly and some weeks every single day by people who had had anomalous experiences, not necessarily of ETs, but anomalous experiences that they couldn't talk about, and they thought they could talk to me about it. So they contacted me, and people began asking me, Paul, have you ever had a close encounter, with an ET? And early on, my answer was, no, I haven't. I know a lot of people who have. But then my answer started to shift, because as I heard more and more testimony, I realized, wait a minute, there was that funny thing that happened to me back in 1985. And then that funny thing, and that funny thing. And I began joining the dots and realized that I had a number of experiences that I had never understood, because I didn't have the framework
Yeah.
to understand it. I had some experiences that I thought, I don't understand it. It must have been demonic, because that was one of my boxes. Or I had that experience, I don't understand it. Must have been angelic, because that was one of my boxes. Or that must have been God. Now I've got more boxes. I realize there are more kinds of entity and
Yeah.
reality and dimensionality to the universe. And I can look back and say, wow, actually, those were ET encounters. I just didn't have the language for it. So the language we have in our heads really can shape what we think we're experiencing. And that's one of the reasons I wrote Escaping from Eden, to try and break the taboo, to put the language of a populated universe back on the table, so people can begin telling their own stories and hearing from others. And I think that will shift the worldview of many if we can talk and listen in that open-minded way.
My next question, I think the two kind of tie together a little bit, but what about shamanic experiences? And so, like, seeing some of the primitive, like, spirituality of the Bible, which is forgotten, and I think that we can look at the other cultures and see some similar things that they're doing, whether it's transcendental meditation, whether it's fasting. Like, there's a bunch of, like, intense spirituality that was practiced in the Bible that we look at it now as primitive. Some of it, I feel like, made it over to the charismatic movements and the Pentecostal movements, the Quakers, and shaking and dancing and shouting, but
Yeah.
then getting really still and quiet and allowing God to speak to you. And there was a lot of, like, really deep spirituality that was in the Old Testament that we look over and forget. Do you have any of those examples where we would call them shamanic, or they would appear to be that way?
Definitely. And it's so interesting how all this joins up. First of all, because a lot of shamanic traditions have language for other dimensional beings and extraterrestrial beings. There is shamanism in the Bible. It's in a way, you've got to go looking for it, but you start reading the stories of the prophets, start looking at what the instructions were to priests, and you realize that you've got a pattern of shamanism there, that there is a use of plants, of smoke, technology, silence, dance, vibration. It occurs in shamanism around the world, and it is there in the Hebrew tradition as well. What made me make the connection with shamanism was when I read the Popol Vuh, which is the Mayan story of where we all came from. And like many of the stories of humanity's evolution, their story is that we were engineered from a primate ancestor and then upgraded until we were us plus precognition, telepathy, remote viewing, self-healing. And the engineers, as they're called in the Popol Vuh, the visitors, said, these humans are a little bit difficult to manage. I mean, how do you enslave or herd a creature that's got precognition? I mean, you're on a losing wicket. So they decided we've got to downgrade these humans. And so they created a vapor that, when it was sprayed over human populations, damaged our neurological connections and brought us back down to a 3D world and our 5 physical senses. What's interesting about that, how it connects with shamanism, is that the same culture that curated that story of the final downgrade has curated all kinds of practices to re-upgrade our experience. And so in the Mesoamerican tradition, you've got psychoaffective teas that are designed to do exactly that, make us more conscious, allow us to see beyond the physical limitation of our locality. Psychoaffective teas that mean we can interact with other kinds of being, that we can begin to see ourselves as a consciousness that precedes this life and follows it. So that kind of shamanism is very connected with this ET narrative. My ears pricked up when I read that because I already knew about this syndrome, neurological syndrome called acquired savant syndrome, which is where people have an accident, they get a brain injury, there's a central nervous system event, and it actually releases phenomenal skills that they didn't have before. Mathematical skills, a new language they couldn't speak before, musical, artistic ability they didn't have before. Very, very objective shift in the upwards direction. And it's so strange. How can an injury make a human being cleverer? And the neurologist who studied this, Darrell Trefford of Marion University, has more than 70 cases of this that he's tracked. You see, our science baffles at that. But the mythology of the Popol Vuh says that's perfectly understandable. We all have those higher capacities, but they've been put into the off position. Shamanism, mystical traditions are all about turning the inhibitors off, re-upgrading us. And so you can find psychoaffective teas, smoke and smoking ceremonies, use of vibration, chanting, music, dance, controlled conscious breathing. These are elements of shamanism in cultures with no contact with each other, apparently, all around the world. And that is what they're aiming at, getting us more conscious, more intelligent, better able to self-heal. And many people who practice those things, myself included, would say it does release these abilities. I can say I've experienced fragmentary moments of remote viewing, precognition, telepathic connection through using those mystical and shamanic modalities. And that, I find that really exciting. And to begin to honor those traditions, instead of talking about witch doctors and seeing them as primitive and so on and so forth, no, they have curated something really, really important. If we could all live more intelligently on this planet, what would that look like?
The evil aliens are wicked rulers or whoever. Why is this stuff forgotten? Why is this Scheduled 1 substance that will lock you up forever if they catch you with any of some of these things that we're talking about, the plant medicines and shamanic medicines, and it's forgotten? The church calls it evil, wicked. Who's running the show? I feel like all sources say the bad guys are running this thing at the top levels of schooling, of society, of government, of the pharmaceutical industries, like that these people do not have our best interest in mind and want to. You talking about ruling us? They're definitely the ruling class of what we have. Who are these people? We call them our presidents. We call them our dictators. Who are they?
Yes, I think the more you read world mythologies and ancient ancestral narratives, the more you start thinking, are these guys writing about 2020? Because the themes really are the same. If you just go to Genesis, for instance, and you look at what the Sky Council is debating over in Genesis, they're debating over how healthy should the human beings be? What access should they have to medical cures? How long-lived should they be? How intelligent should they be? How much access to information? How much awareness and access should they have to us, the powerful ones? These are all the debates they have, and it seems to me they're the same debates being had in the 21st century. Access to clean and safe drinking water, access to safe food, access to medication, access to education, access to the truth of what's going on. These are all live issues. Is it a coincidence that these are the same live issues? Genesis suggests that there is this cabal of other species who all have a stakeholding in Project Earth and Project Humanity, and they're conflicting over it. Then, is that story told to tell us why things work the way they do today? And my suspicion is yes, it's a story about now just as much as then. And then there's the question of, well, how does this relate to the power structures we can see? Because there's a very interesting moment that comes if you follow the stories of the Bible, where you've got the powerful ones seemingly running the show, but all of a sudden they're not there anymore. You've just got the priesthoods. You've just got the technology. You've got the Ark of the Covenant. You've got the Urim and Thummim. You've got people going and consulting their totems. But where actually are the powerful ones? And that story, anyone who's watched the original series of Star Trek knows that story got told a couple of times, where it turned out things were being run by the priesthoods, but the gods had disappeared. But it raises a really interesting question, the one you just asked. Who's in charge? Why are these the issues? And why are they the issues in 2020 after we've had, revolutions? We've got democracy, we've got clean the energy. Media. Clean energy, exactly. Why is this still an issue? And you see, clean energy is a really good illustration of the question, because Ed Mitchell, the sixth man to walk on the moon, as a NASA alumnus, he would have been bound by layer on layer of official secrets laws. And yet he was very outspoken in championing the cause of disclosure. And he said one of the things that motivated him was that the human race should be benefiting from clean, free energy, which he believed was available through our technological contact with ET species. And that's what he was allowed to say. So goodness only knows what he was not allowed to say. Now, if you listen to him and you come to that conclusion, then you come back to the question of, why is that technology suppressed, and who's suppressing it? Who and by what authority has made the decision we're not going to have free energy and we're going to be enslaved to oil companies, so on and so forth? We see the conflict over clean energy playing out in our politics, but is the root of it actually somewhere else? You can see it also. I talk about this in the sequel to Escaping from Eden. There is a conflict on planet Earth right now between two models of farming. There's the traditional model of farming, which is rotational, natural, organic, sustainable. And then you've got an industrial model where you have infertile soil and you need petrochemicals to grow your food, and then you have to buy patented foods every year to grow them. Those are two different models of farming. And my studies in Escaping from Eden and for its sequel suggest to me that those conflicts originate off planet and in cultures that came from somewhere else.
Gets interesting. I think these so-called leaders have, malicious intent and feeding us things that our bodies weren't meant to eat, and they're okay with signing off on stuff. I mean, the list goes on and on and on.
Just not to make it too bleak, something I forgot to say though is worth remembering. On that council, there's a spectrum. There's a spectrum of beings. There's some who have no empathy for humanity at all, and there are others who I believe are here because they are concerned for us and they are advocating for us. And there's been this strange kind of stability, and a stability of non-disclosure for at least 70 years, because there is a power balance, but a little bit of hope, because I think there is a positive ET presence that's involved in the story of humanity right now as well.
I mean, some people would, how do you choose though? Do we vote these individuals in? Surely not. The Democrat and the Republic is one good and one bad, because the church will definitely tell you that the Democratic Party is the satanic, God-hating party, and the Republican is the God-fearing, keep God in school, like traditional. Like they literally see it like that for sure. But that's not what you're saying, right? Not we can't elect our gods, right?
No, we can't. And I think one of the things that when people get this paradigm shift and they realize there is an ET presence, it's been here a long time, and there are layers of government that know about it, it can be a very deflating moment, because you can feel so disempowered by that. And as you begin to absorb the implications of it, you realize how little we're able to affect through our democratic structures. Democracy, I think, achieved some wonderful things, particularly after democratic reforms in the 1800s, right up until when I was a young boy. And since that time, we've seen power shift away from democratic structures again. And it's becoming depressingly clear that there is an elite that stands above democracy. And we see it reflected in the power of corporations. But we also understand that it's happening at a covert level. The mythologies tell us this. I've come to conclude that is the case. And so my questions have had to shift, because when I was younger, I was hopeful that political processes could really bring reform and positive change, because I'd seen a little bit of that as a boy. Now I'm not very hopeful. I think our democratic structures have really been hijacked. And so my question has to shift to how do I live in this world? How do we live in this world? This world where there has been this Sky Council present all this time. How do we have the best, most conscious human experience we can? How do we empower ourselves? And I think that peer-to-peer conversation and disclosure is really important in this whole process, because if we simply allow ourselves to be made too busy by the world of work or syllabus bound in the world of education, then we won't look above the parapet and see a much bigger picture. This is why I love what you're doing, TruthSeekah. I think your show and shows like this are really, really important in the 21st century, because it's how we empower ourselves. Talking, listening, getting the bigger picture, understanding who we are, and knowing that our power doesn't come from our superiors, doesn't come from the governments over us. It comes from who we are and our relationship to the cosmos, our relationship to consciousness and intelligence. And that's more and more where my confidence and my hope comes from.
They've been here the whole time, and all we had to do was stop and look up, or stop and look within, one or the other. But we're so focused on, these things that you've mentioned out here, and it's very much a matrix that keeps you locked in, that you can't. Literally, all you have to do is just like stargaze for just a couple days or something. Go out.
That's so true.
But how hard is that to say, hey, I'm going to spend 7 hours outside tonight stargazing, or you'll spend 7 hours doing other things, working your job, but just being present and in the moment. So, I mean, all of the things you've mentioned about, the spirituality and the meditation and breath work and plant ceremonies, which are like booming right now, and it, like, knowledge is increasing about our connection with the plants, and how they can help us and serve as a medicine. And so this stuff is because of these talks, because of these podcasts and art and music and books and everything, is bringing this stuff back to the table. So kudos to you as well. We're at the top of the hour. We're going to go ahead and go to a quick break, and then we'll come back. Got a bunch more questions for you, Paul. I'm enjoying it so much, man. We'll be right back. Thank you, guys.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks. All right. I'll just take a quick pause.
Yeah, there's no sound here. You guys know what I'm saying, though. I don't know what's up with my computer, but you guys know what I'm saying. Go buy the meditation. You already know. Go to TruthSeekah.com. Get the meditation. This guy right here on camera said it a lot better than I could, but that's what this commercial is about. Something's up with my audio right now. And just so you guys know, we're in the middle of a hurricane. We're in the middle of a hurricane. Like, there's literally 100-mile-an-hour winds back and forth outside. So I'm hearing it outside my window. Sounds pretty scary. We're going through a hurricane right now, but we've got the internet. We've got power. We're making it happen. Paul, we're talking about your book, Escaping from Eden. Enjoying it, man, so far, and really excited to dig into your work. Because it's not a one-stop shop. Like, it's not just, this isn't your song and dance and you ride off into the wind. Like, you have a lot of stuff that you're bringing to the table when it comes to spirituality, when it comes to what I would say is true Christianity, and returning to the essence of living from the heart, as some would say, and many different aspects with that. And so I'm, like I said, I went to your website whenever I got the email from your publicist or whatever to check out your work, and I do it a quick 2-minute glance. I go and say, okay, that. Okay, that's a great conversation. I've got questions, and literally that's it. Okay, let's book it. It's going to be a great talk. And so I had a quick, synopsis of what you were bringing to the table.
Younger than me, so you must have been learning at a really rapid rate through your life.
Well, I didn't do well in school, and I never learned how to study in school. Like, I just showed up and didn't, I don't know if it was ADD or whatever. I couldn't study. It didn't interest me. And then when I finally got born again and started reading the scriptures, and then all of this other material, for the first time, like, studying became a new world for me.